Well, welcome to Psychology. That was the first contender for Psychology theme tune. And in future videos, I'll be putting some other tunes in there for you, and you can vote on which one you think really is the most enthusiastic. But I guess you have to go some to beat that one, wouldn't you? I've been working on that one for quite a while. Anyway, welcome to Psychology. Congratulations on getting through your GCSEs. Which means, therefore, that we're going to get to work together for a couple of years, which means that you must be the kind of people who are really interested in life, really interested in human behaviour, want to explain why people think the way they do, why they act the way they do. And, you know, given the recent COVID crisis and everything that we've been going through in 2020, those questions are more important than ever. So then, what maybe you would be surprised to know is that that not all psychologists agree about things. That in actual fact, there's an awful lot of disagreement about how we explain a behaviour. You could take one particular behaviour or one way of thinking, and you could have lots and lots of different ways of explaining it. What we do in our first year of the course, in year 12, is we actually look at 5 different approaches to psychology, 5 different ways of explaining behaviour or understanding why people behave the way they do. And you have to know about all of those, and we do go over each of those in quite a lot of detail, but I wanted to give you in this first little talk a quick introduction to all 5. So I'm going to tell you about 5 different ways of explaining behaviour, and for each of those there are 3 key assumptions, and assumptions like a basic belief that each of these approaches have. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the biological approach, which, as you might imagine, it says that the way we think and the way we behave can be explained by our biology. So either stuff going on inside our bodies or things to do with evolution. So the evolutionary one is quite a big picture one, and that's the first one. So the first assumption is to do with evolutionary influences. Hopefully you'll be familiar with some of the stuff you did in GCSE science about evolution. And it says that what happens is that people pass on useful behaviours or useful characteristics from one generation to another. So, for example, say we want to explain, why do we all live in towns and cities and villages? Why don't people just live on little caves on their own? Well, if we think back a couple of million years to when people were hunting and gathering, when humans first arrived, then if someone went off to hunt an animal on their own with a spear, even if it was a really good spear, one person on their own, they are much more likely to get killed and not pass on their genes. However, what if a whole team of them went out and they all worked together and they did the hunting that they needed to do? Those people are more likely to survive, and that gene that makes us all get together is going to be passed on, whereas the loner type gene maybe won't be passed on so much. Okay, so one way we can explain behaviour is we can say it's evolved with inherited genes that cause us to behave in some ways rather than others. Okay, that's a big picture one. What about inside our brains? What's going on in there? Well, biological psychologists believe that the brain is, as we know, split up into lots of different parts, and that each of these different parts have different functions. So we have, for example, 4 lobes, 4 different bits of the brain. And they do different things. So the front of our brain, the frontal bit of our cortex, as we call it, that's to do with things like thinking and creativity. It's the bit that you're using now when you're listening to me. And then we have also while you're listening to me, you might be thinking, "Cool, I feel a bit chilly in here. I might put on a jacket," or you might be thinking, "Oh, I'm thirsty." All of those things are controlled by another lobe called the parietal lobe that deals with sensory information and temperature. Then you might think, "Oh, I've just remembered I need to charge my phone now because it's beginning to run out." Whatever. Any of the memory kind of things is taking place in a place called the temporal lobe, and that also is useful for hearing. So we use that to process information. So you're using that when you're hearing me and understanding what I'm saying. That is the temporal lobe that's working. And clearly, you're also seeing me, hopefully. And that's That's the final lobe, the occipital lobe. So that's another assumption, is that different parts of the brain are going to affect us in different ways. And so, for example, if one part of your brain, the frontal lobe was affected, one thing that was damaged in one way, you might struggle therefore to produce language, to speak. And then, but another part of the brain, in the temporal lobe, if that was damaged, you might struggle to actually understand what other people are saying to you. So we've got a genetic one. The second one is to do with that's called localization of brain function. Each location of the brain has a different function. And then the third assumption is to do with what we call neurotransmitters. So we've got chemicals in our brain that actually affect our behaviour, and the level of the behaviour, the level of the neurotransmitter is important. So, for example, there's one called serotonin that's very good, that helps us cope very well with life, that can actually make us feel quite happy, helps us deal with pain and fear and things like that. And it's one that we really need to boost to have a fully mentally healthy life. A low level of that is connected with depression. Some people say, "Oh, that's the explanation for depression, is that someone's got a low level of serotonin." Someone with schizophrenia, for example, a very scary disease, that's been connected with having too much of another neurotransmitter called dopamine. So those are the three assumptions of the biological approach. It's suggesting that in actual fact what we need to do is explain behaviour by looking at chemical and biological things that are happening, and the reason we do the things we do are because of those things. Okay, the second approach that we look at is called the psychodynamic approach. And that's psychodynamic means that somehow inside our mind there are different forces that are moving about and working together or working against each other to make us behave in the way that we do. And this was put forward and was first introduced by Sigmund Freud. Okay, so one of the key beliefs is that, in actual fact, one of the major contributions he made was that experiences that we have when we're very young children, the way we're fed, for example, the way we're potty trained, those kind of things are going to have an effect on our behaviour when we're older. So it's really, and he put a lot of emphasis on the way you bring up your children is going to affect the way they're going to be as adults. We'll look at more of that. Another one is this idea of the unconscious mind. Have you ever had a kind of explosion where someone says to you something like, well, you may have heard, if it hasn't happened to you, you might have heard other people do this, where they get home and their mum says to them, "God, you look tired today," and they say, "What are you talking about, Mum? Just leave me alone. Why can't you just keep your nose out of it?" Blah blah. And often doing things without actually being able to explain why we did them. And maybe that poor person's had a hard day at school, and somehow that's it just came out in that discussion with that poor old mum. But even so, things that we're not aware of, according to Freud, things that we're not aware of, unconscious forces are responsible for some of the things that we do, and we don't even know that we're doing them. He also suggested that we have three parts to our personality. That there's like a primitive part that's only interested in food and sex and anger and those kind of things. And that's when you look at a baby, babies don't do very much apart from cry and poo, really. And all they want is food, and they want it now, and if they don't get what they want, they cry and all the rest of it. But then there are other parts of the adult personality. There's the ego, what he calls the conscious part that we're actually aware of. And then the superego, which acts as a way of, it talks about our values and what we should do. We'll go more into that in detail when we come across it. So that's two approaches, very different in the way they look at things. Behaviorism came after Freud, And this was the idea that, in actual fact, and it was trying to be scientific, this suggests that human beings, when they're born completely empty. So whereas the biological approach and the behavior and a bit of the psychodynamic approach says that a lot of our behavior comes from inside, the behaviorist approach says no, actual fact, everything that happens to us is learned from the outside. So so we're born, if you like, they call it, the first assumption is they say that we're born as a blank slate, is that everything that we do is learned from the outside. Okay. The second idea is that behaviour is learned through conditioning. Conditioning is another word for training, again, and we'll go into more detail in that. So that is the idea that we do things, for example, if we're reinforced or rewarded for doing something, we're more likely to do it. And if we're punished, we're less likely to do it. It's more detailed than that, but again, you can see how that might explain behaviour in schools or wherever. Also, behaviourists believe that humans and animals behave in similar ways, and we learn in similar ways. And if we learn in similar ways, then we can actually do experiments on animals and then transfer the findings to humans. More about that, again, to follow. Fourth approach is the cognitive approach, and that says, actually, we're not like blank slates, we're like computers. And what happens is that we're literally like computers. We look around, information comes in from the outside world, we process that information like a computer, and then we respond or we do something. Input, processing, and output, if you like. Interesting one to an interesting one, really. Just I'm going to pause because I can't think why it's an interesting one. I'll come back to you. Yeah, it's an interesting one because it does seem that there's probably more to human beings than just processing information. We've got feelings and emotions, for example, and that's something that might not be dealt with there. The cognitive approach also says that we're driven by, our behaviour is driven by the way we think about things, by our internal mental processes. So we can have, so if you think of someone who's kind of got a very negative outlook on life, for example, they may be much less likely to try a new thing than someone who's got a positive outlook on life. More detail on that later, but that's the idea, is that the way we think is going to direct the way we behave. And then the third one is that what we do is that, again, thinking a little bit to do with computers, is that inside our brains or inside our minds we store what we call schemas, and they're like packets of information. So if I say the word restaurant to you, for example, or library, you'd have a picture of what that means. I wouldn't have to explain every single bit of it. You'd have your own picture. And the cognitive approach says that those pictures and what we have in those pictures affects the way we behave in the world. So if I've got a picture of the world where everyone is kind and generous towards us and welcoming and all the rest of it, then I might go out and I might be smiling at everyone, I might be very friendly and all the rest of it. But if I've got a picture of the world where the world is a bit scary and all the rest of it, then my behaviour would be different. So that's 4. So we've had biological, psychodynamic, behaviourist, and cognitive. The final one is slightly different, and it's very modern, actually. It's not been going all that long, but it's called it's called positive psychology. And they've got different kinds of belief. They don't really try and explain behaviour in the same way as the other 4, but they've still got a very important insight. So, for example, the positive approach believes that we've got free will, that we can actually choose what we want to do. We're not driven by our biology. It's not our genes telling us what to do. It's not the environment telling us what to do, which is what the behaviourists would say. So it's very different in that way. And you might think, actually, I'm just going to pause this video for a minute. If you want to do that, that's fine, but that's your free will. Another thing that they do is that the positive approach focuses on goodness and excellence in human beings. Instead of dealing with problems that people have, mental health problems and all the rest of it, which are important, it says, but what about everyone else? How can we put some of our emphasis? How can we think on the positive side of things. How can we build people up? And that's the second one. And then the third one is it focuses on the good life. What does it mean to live a good life? Is a good life to do just with pleasure and having as much ice cream as you can eat, having a yacht? Or is it to do with spending every day really absorbed in what you do and having an engrossing time, a time when you think this is amazing, this stuff? Or is it to do with meaning? Is it to do with doing good things for other people? Yeah, so that's all five of the approaches: biological, psychodynamic, behaviourist, cognitive, and positive. So there might be a quiz to follow. Have a think about that. Have a think about which ones to you sounds like the most useful way of explaining why people behave the way they do. Okay, have a lovely day, and I'll be back in touch soon.